Welcome to SarderTV. I'm Vaishali Jain. We have the pleasure of having Betty Liu with us today. Betty Liu is an award-winning Bloomberg TV anchor. She's the founder of Radiate, a media technology company, and she's author of the book called Work Smarts: What CEOs Say You Need to Know to Get Ahead. And she's joining us to tell us more. Betty, thank you so much for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so you're doing a lot. You're an anchor on Bloomberg TV. You started your own media company, and you wrote a book.
Right. Not all at the same time,
right?
But it almost kind of felt like it. Yes.
So let's start out with your book. Start out by telling us what the central theme of the book is.
So the book really came out of like a lot of things that we often do in life. It just comes out of your own personal experience. Several years ago, I was going through a little bit of a turning point in my career, and I was seeking advice from a lot of people that I knew who were coming onto Bloomberg Television. So these were some of the smartest people that I knew, very successful in business and just in life as well. So I started to go to them and ask them questions, get advice from them. And I realized that as I was talking to them, they had some amazing anecdotes, amazing pieces of advice that I wanted other people also to benefit from. So I decided that this was a perfect opportunity to be able to collect all of their wisdom into a book. And that's essentially how Work Smarts got born. So I took all the nuggets that I was learning from people like Warren Buffett or Jamie Dimon or Sally Krawcheck and Elon Musk, and I put it into this book. And when I published it, a lot of people came up to me and said, thank you so much for writing this. I have had all these sorts of questions too. And if you have those questions, it's so good that if you have them, then I know that I'm not alone. That I also feel like that there's people out there who can answer them and who have the same kinds of questions. So it just felt like I was helping people, and that was a really good feeling too. And at the same time, helping myself too. I had a lot of my own questions answered as well.
That's great. Yeah. Who would benefit from reading your book?
Hopefully everyone, but basically it's really geared towards people who are in their early to mid career, where they're changing a lot, there's a lot of transformation going on, they're balancing family and work, and they're deciding whether this is their true passion, their true vocation, or should they move on to something else. There are people who are inside budding entrepreneurs who have questions about whether they should make a career switch. Those kinds of people, to me it's everyday people. I feel like everyone wants to do the best that they can, and that's really what it's geared towards. It's anyone who feels like they want to improve their life and they want to reach as far as they can. That's really who the book is for.
I know you mentioned entrepreneurs, and one thing that you do mention in your book is how some of the most successful people are either entrepreneurs or have an entrepreneurial mindset.
Yes.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, entrepreneurs these days, that word is so hot, it's such a big buzzword, but I think it is so because I think everyone feels in some ways that they are an entrepreneur or they want to be an entrepreneur. And we tend to right now turn them into celebrities, right? Entrepreneurs are celebrities these days, particularly those coming out of Silicon Valley. But when I was talking about that in the book, it's really people who are entrepreneurs who are actually starting their own companies, or people who are inside companies who are basically entrepreneurs, right? They're always looking at what new project can they pitch, what new innovative way that they can do their job differently, or help their bosses do it differently, and how can they shine within their own company. And it's just that entrepreneurial mindset, which I best can describe is a way that Sam Zell described it to me, which is in the book. He was like, the definition of an entrepreneur is someone who walks by a man paint on a ladder, painting the wall, and he said most people will just look at that and say, okay, the guy can either paint to the right or he can paint to the left. And an entrepreneur will walk by this person and think, well, why can't the person have two brushes and paint both sides? So, it's always someone who's thinking, how can I do something that everyone takes as conventional wisdom and do it a little bit differently? And that's really the definition of an entrepreneur.
Sure. Now, can you demonstrate a case study to kind of give us an example of this?
To me, every CEO that I've talked to, I think, has an entrepreneurial mindset. So, in my mind, they're all kind of like entrepreneurs in their own way, whether or not they actually started the company that they're now the head of, or they rose up within the ranks. So they all have this idea of being an entrepreneur. Who's the most famous entrepreneur right now? It's Elon Musk, right? So he's classic case of someone who just looks at something and says, that's, the stupidest way that you could do it. I have, an even better way. And if you don't believe me, I'll just go and build it. And he just does, it's whether it's building the best electric car out there or building the cheapest rocket, reusable rocket out there. I remember he said to me, like, we're building rockets at like 10 times the cost that they need to be. And the reason why is not because we can't build it that way. It's just because of the system, and just how people are building these things just because that's the way they've always built them, not understanding that the root cause of it is a lot of waste and a lot of bureaucratic waste. And same thing with like the Hyperloop, how do I make that? So he's just a classic case of someone who just looks at something and says, conventional wisdom is the enemy of entrepreneurialism, or is the enemy of innovation, and and he's going to go and change it.
Now, there's something that you mentioned in the book, some advice that entrepreneurs always seem to be following, and that's always be moving and always be closing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about those concepts?
Well, the always be moving came from the always be closing. So there's that movie Glenn Ross, Alec Baldwin, famous lines, right, where in the scene, he's pushing these guys to sell, to make the deal. And it's ABC, always be closing, right? Very, very effective, and that's kind of the way we think all the time. We think very we need to be thinking in these sort of like micro scripts, these simple ways. So you just borrow from that and you say, always be moving. And I remember I described always be moving one time to an audience, and I think they literally meant they thought I meant always be physically moving. And that's not what I mean at all. What I mean by that is underlying the always be moving is the 80-20 rule, which is what I live by. You should spend 20% of your time thinking and 80% of your time doing. And that's how you can succeed. So always be moving is basically, always be executing, always be taking action, not so much thinking. Thinking is a part of it, but always be finding a way how you can keep doing something to head towards your goal. So a perfect example is if you have hit a speed bump, you lost a deal, you didn't get a sale, whatever it might be, always be moving means you can give yourself the night to feel bad about it, go eat a tub of ice cream, cry about it, talk to your friends, have a drink, whatever. The next morning, get out there and go again. So it's always be moving. That's what I mean.
And there was one conversation that you mentioned with Rachel Ray, the cooking star and the daytime talk show host, about what her breakthrough moment was. And she said that there was never really any such thing. It was just a series of happy accidents. Can you tell us more about this?
It's not just a Rachel Ray, but it's an Ellen DeGeneres, or it's anybody famous that you can think of, anyone who has suddenly become very successful, or suddenly in your view. There's two things. It's never as planned as you think it is. So when people see people who are very, very successful, they think, oh my God, they had this grand master plan, and they were back there going, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, and then all of a sudden I'm going to have 20 million followers, I'm going to be making hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's never the case. It never is as planned as it is. All it really is that the person continue to be moving, right? Continue to be working towards their goal. And if you continue to do that, you will get to where you are. The second thing about that is there probably are rare cases of an overnight success story. And I think about those YouTube stars, or not even YouTube stars, a viral sensation. I was watching a YouTube video the other week of Alex the Target Boy, who became famous because he had one picture taken of him and suddenly he had 2 million followers. Yes, there's a very rare instance of an overnight sensation, but usually when someone hits that mass consciousness of success, it always comes down to years and years of hard and diligent work, nobody knowing who they are, having a very small audience, but it's just all about building that until you get to that critical mass, and suddenly people notice you and they're like, wow, what an overnight success story. Where did you come from? It rarely ever is, because it literally is overnight.
Any other key lessons or takeaways that the rest of us can learn from?
Well, we talked about some of them, which is, the idea of spend 20% of your time thinking and 80% of your time moving. I think that, one of the things that really struck me when I wrote the book, and also since then, is just no matter how successful you are, people struggle no matter what. And the struggles are different, but everyone has the same fears. Everyone feels the same, obstacles. Everyone has their own version of struggling. So I think it's, I always tell people this, that like, you should never say to yourself, oh, if I had like $20 million, I'll be the happiest person on earth. Well, you might be someone who may never have to worry about paying for healthcare, but you're going to inherit a different set of obstacles. So, so just throw out that idea. It doesn't mean that you don't go for those goals, but I mean, everybody from Warren Buffett on down, they all have their own struggles. They all have their own, they're different kinds. So I guess, so that I thought was an interesting and important lesson for me. It was sort of like a reality check that, you should go for your goals, but you should also realize that once you get there, it doesn't mean all your problems go away.
Tell us what the Q factor is and why that's important.
Okay, so the Q factor is something in television that they have, which is, it's your likability. It's how likable you are and how much the audience connects to you. And some people just have it naturally, and some people don't. And some people connect to the audience very easily, and some people don't. So that's just something I borrowed from television, which is that the Q factor is basically a sense of likability. How likable are you? And the reason why that's so important is that as you get older in your career, your soft skills become much more important. So when you're young and you're in your 20s, like you're nobody, and people don't expect much from you, and you're just out there to prove that you're smart and you're quick and you can do it. So your hard skills are really, really important, like how fast you are and how smart you are and all of that stuff. And you don't have to do a lot of politicking because you're just a little young gun in the office. And I learned this very much myself. So in your 20s, that's important. But as you get older and you rise up in your career, you basically get put into the same places that it's like a filtering process. You rise up as well as other people who are just as good as you rise up. So that by the time you're in your late 30s, your early 40s, your peers are people who've also gone through the filtering process. And they're all basically about the same as you. They're all just as intelligent as you. They're all just as educated. They're all just as savvy. And so the competition then is not about how smart you are or what your hard skills are. It's about what your soft skills are. How do you relate to people? How are you as a leader? How do you relate to people? Can you motivate your team? Can you motivate your team to extract more out of them? More productivity, more creativity, more innovation? Can you retain your talent? It becomes more about that than it is about whether you can do something quickly or anything or how well you code or whatever it might be, whatever hard skill it is. So that's really where the Q factor comes in, which is what is your likability. I think people though mistake likability with being nice. So I'm not so sure if CEOs fail because of the likability factor rather than they may fail because they made some sort of mistake related to, whatever it might be. It's not necessarily because they're unlikable people. Steve Jobs was, by all accounts, not a nice person, right, to work for. I think that's pretty well documented by now. And there's a lot of CEOs actually out there who are, who are not necessarily nice. But when I say likability, it's this feeling that you're connected to that person, or you admire that person, and you look to them as a leader. That's a likability factor. So I want people to understand that it's really not about being super nice, because being super nice actually can make you very unlikable. It's actually about how much you can connect to people and how you deliver that.
Another thing you talk about is confirmation bias. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I actually love the whole concept of confirmation bias because I use that myself in practice and I look for it a lot too. And particularly at a time in this country, I think that's something that a lot of people are thinking about these days, which are, inherent biases in the workplace. So confirmation bias is essentially the idea that, all of us as human beings have our biases. We just do. I mean, there isn't really any way around that. But what people tend to do is they tend to, if they meet let's say a white male from Texas, they tend to have biases about this person. They, will likely think that this person is a Republican, He probably drives a truck, is for gun rights. There's these sorts of like typical stereotypes, right? So confirmation bias is when you meet that person, you tend to look for indicators that will confirm your bias. So if he does pull up in a truck, you're like, of course. If he likes barbecue, you're like, of course. But that also means that you ignore things that are against that stereotype. So, if he says he, speaks Japanese or was an exchange student in Japan, you might be like, oh, that's interesting. That's really different. But then that won't change your mind about him as much as you getting an affirmation that he likes barbecue, if that makes sense. So you tend to look for things to confirm your bias. So one of the ways I say that you can actually up your Q factor and you can up your likability is when you actually go against people's biases. So another perfect example is, let's say you meet a Chinese guy who works in the IT department, and you figure he probably loves to play video games, and he, any number of stereotypes that you can think about of a Chinese man in an IT department of a big bank, let's say. But then if you find out he likes to, polka dance at night, with his wife, or that he goes out and smokes cigars, and, anything that's absolutely so crazily different from what you expect, that automatically ups his likability. You suddenly take notice and you say, wait a minute, this person is absolutely nothing like what I thought. That actually has a very dramatic effect on upping a person's likability. So I always say, not that I'm telling people to go out there and specifically, try to find and do things that are going to be so different from their own stereotype, but just to be aware of that and to not be afraid of expressing that individuality.
So you also talk about networking in the book.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about how some of the most successful people network?
Yeah, there's two types of networking. So there's outbound networking and then there's inbound networking. So the outbound networking is what a lot of people do already. They go to conferences, they cold call people that they admire, they try to find a connection to another person who knows someone that they want to target. So that's typical networking, and I don't love the word networking. I think that networking is an art. I get approached a lot about how do you network, and it's always very difficult to explain exactly how. But it's generally making connections and knowing how to make connections. So there's outbound networking, but I think just as important and maybe even more important is inbound networking. So inbound networking is actually people coming to seek you out. And the only way you can actually do that is if you start building your brand and that you become known for something. What I found is that, as I advanced in my career, I was starting to create some brands for myself. I was starting to become known as something. So, one brand is, being the CEO whisperer, whatever that means. But someone who knows a lot of CEOs who I talk to, someone who's, I don't want to say examine their mindset, but who spent a lot of time with them to find out, what makes them tick, what are their challenges, how do you become a CEO, what's the pathway to that. So that's become sort of my brand. And I noticed that as I became more and more advanced in that people would come seek me out for speeches or to just, get my thoughts, to talk to them about this. And if someone had a question about it, I would become the reference, for them, oh, you should talk to Betty about this. And that's really powerful. And I think people forget how powerful that is to get that inbound networking path. So always be outbound networking. That's really, really important. But also think about how you build your brand so that people seek you out. And because when people seek you out, that connection is far stronger than when you seek someone else's time. So those are the two kinds of networking to think about as you advance in your career.
What would you say is your most effective networking tool?
Most effective networking tool is there's probably two. One would just be, as you network and as you grow your network, you are able to connect people for various reasons, just because maybe they have a commonality or maybe they could, partner together on a project or whatever. that ability to connect to other people is very powerful and keeps you connected and makes you a powerful networker. So I would say that, you know, being a connector for people is extremely powerful. Not everyone does it, but everyone should. So I think that's one tool. But I think the other one that is much more at people's disposal is just information. I think people forget that even though we live in this age of like information at your fingertips, precisely because there's so much information out there, that you can help provide people very targeted information. So an example of that is, you know, people ask me, how did you get to Warren Buffett? He didn't know you, like, there was absolutely no connection to him whatsoever. I didn't know anybody around him either. So how did I get to Warren? One of the things I did, and I did it over the course of a few years, is I would always send him, and even though if he had read it or not, but I always sent him articles or you know, articles that were published by Bloomberg or elsewhere that were of interest to him. You know, so it might have to deal with one of his companies. It might be something related to philanthropy. You know, anything that I thought that would be of interest to him, I just sent over to his secretary. And, you know, whether he read it or not, he knew that he was always being helped by me to give him some information. And people, no matter at what level that they sit at, whether you're a CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company or you're just, you know, a young entrepreneur starting out, you absolutely need information. Information is critical for you. Like, you need to have information. And just because you are the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, it does not mean you have all the information out there. You are not the smartest person in the room. You know, there's a ton of information out there that you need to make informed decisions. So if you can help that person cut through the clutter and give them things that are of interest, you become a much more powerful resource for them, and you get their attention a lot more than just sending them emails every day or whatever and say, hey, can you sit down with me for 15 minutes? They have no incentive to sit down with you. I mean, they're busy people. So I think the more you make yourself a resource, the better the chances are that you'll reach that person.
Mm-hmm. And what's interesting here is that you said it was the course of a few years that this happened, right?
It was the course of a few years. I mean, nothing is ever an overnight success. You know, you have to just, you know, continue. I always live by that classic adage, which is, you know, every no is one step closer to a yes. So I never take no for an answer. It doesn't mean it's not hard to hear the no. It's very hard to hear no's, but I've had so many instances where a no turned into a yes, Buffett being one of them, that impossible is an option. You know, nothing's ever impossible. There's always a way to get to the goal.
The other thing that you talk about is mentorship, mm-hmm. and specifically for women. Women do find it hard to find mentors, especially as they're climbing up the ranks in their career. What advice have some of the most successful women out there given about mentorship?
I don't know if I've had advice from other women about mentorship, but I've had women give me advice that's really helped me out in my career. Mm-hmm. When I was switching careers, I was going from print to television. And when I was doing it, I was doing this at a time when I was on maternity leave, and I, you know, had written the book, but it was a transition time for me. It's one of like my first of many transitions, it feels like. I remember I went from being on maternity leave and having this print job to going to television. I finally got my job offer at CNBC Asia, actually, in Hong Kong. And I was so like relieved that I could get this job. I really thought that if I didn't get this job, like my career would be over, or that, you know, it would be much harder for me to get a better job. And I was so nervous at that time that when the boss at CNBC Asia had given me, and she was a female, she had given me the offer, like I took the first offer that was given to me. So I didn't negotiate. I just, you know, she gave me the salary price, and I said, okay, I'm there. And I was just so relieved that I even got the job. So fast forward 2 years later, I, you know, got my job at Bloomberg, and she was very, you know, congratulatory. She was like, I'm sorry, you know, we're going to miss you. And she and I went out for a drink. It's probably the first time actually we'd gone out for like a real drink. And I remember like she said to me, you know, Betty, like I was all prepared to make a counteroffer because I thought you were going to counteroffer me. And she said, you took my lowest bid. And she was like, don't ever do that again. You know, I undersold myself. So, I still remember that to this day. She was like, don't ever, ever do that. And, I gave it to her. I gave her a gift by not negotiating. So ever since then, that was like one of the biggest lessons I learned, which is like, and I think this is especially relevant for women, is not to undervalue yourself, not to be so grateful. Oh my God, that anybody would hire someone like you. Exactly how I felt. I was like, oh, someone would even hire me. Totally devalued myself and took the worst offer. Yeah. So that was a big lesson.
Yeah. There's also a very small percentage of women who are CEOs in Fortune 500 companies.
Mm-hmm. I think it's like 20% or something like that. Yeah.
What is the reason behind this? What do you think are some of the reasons behind this?
There's inherent biases, obviously, that that we see in the workplace. I think that one of the things that happens in the workplace, and I think it happens just with the way people's human nature is that they tend to want to work with people that they're comfortable with, that they're friends with, or that they have chemistry with, and that often means that you work with people who are very similar to you, and you rely on people who are very similar to you. So one of the things that happened during the financial crisis here is, women noticed that the number of Wall Street women, actually declined during the financial crisis, in terms of senior women. And, and I remember one CEO had described it very well, which is there wasn't this intent on excluding women. I'm sure there are, moments like that, but there wasn't like intent to exclude women from the inner echelons or the inner circles of these big banks. But just that at a moment of crisis, you tend to want to bring together the people you most trust and you work the best with. And unfortunately, that means that you often pick the people that look just like you and that grew up just like you. And so it's self-reinforcing. So that's why it's good that companies are waking up to more diversity. It's good that it's becoming more formalized. And I think in the beginning it's more awkward. It's not pleasant sometimes. It feels forced, to try to increase diversity. But the more that people of different backgrounds work together and have a longer period of time like that, the more time there is to create that chemistry and to have that trustworthiness between people, so that it doesn't become such an awkward or such a problem in the workplace.
Negotiating, asking for a raise can be difficult. What are some of the ways you suggest people can ask for a raise?
Well, I think they should go in there, like I go into every TV interview, like absolutely prepared. So they have like all of their research done, if they're going to make any kind of accusation, like I'm, underpaid, I'm the most underpaid employee in my department, well, they better make sure that that's actually true, because the minute the boss says back to you, no, you're not, this person is, your whole entire argument is blown. So I think you go in there, absolutely prepared. I think you also should go in there and try to put yourself as much in your boss's shoes, even though what you want ultimately is obviously the promotion or the raise for yourself. So if you go in there thinking like, what have I done for my company, for my team? Think about your boss and how they might see the value of giving you that promotion or that raise. If you let them see that, that will increase your chances. So you can go in there with like a list of things that you've done, you've accomplished over the last 12 months, but also go in there with a list of all the things you plan on doing in the next 12 months and how you can increase the bottom line for the company, or how you can increase your boss's performance, for his unit. So as much as you can make the argument of how valuable you are, the worst thing you can do is go in there and say, I deserve a raise because of some personal reason, or that I deserve it. But you also have to remember that the minute you do that, the minute you go in for a promotion, or the minute you go in for a raise because you feel unhappy, just remember that you're going to signal to your boss that you might be leaving. So I think you just have to be prepared that when you make that argument, in their mind, what they're thinking is, she's unhappy or he's unhappy, And if they don't get what they want, they're going to leave the company. And me as the boss now has to think, who am I going to get to replace you? So just remember that. Just have your eyes wide open. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but you shouldn't be surprised that that's how the tone might change afterwards. Yeah. But you go in there, prove to them that you're worth it, and it will likely go the direction that you want it to go.
What tips can you provide for how to best negotiate?
I think the best way I negotiate, or the best way that I can try to sell something, is I always try to listen to the other person. So I always try to do more listening than talking. It's very unusual for me to sit here and talk, because I actually hate talking. I like listening to people. But I think in any negotiation, you always have to think about, what is it that the person on the other side wants, and listen to what they want. One very easy sales technique is to just listen to what this person is saying to you, potential client or whatever, and then just repeat back what they say. And surprisingly, it's so interesting when you actually do it to hear people say, someone says, "Oh, I need the software to help me measure performance better." You just mirror that back to them. They're like, "Yeah, that's exactly what I need." It's incredible how mirroring someone is so effective, and it's only because people love to be heard. They just want to be heard. So, and you have to remember also that, and I always say this to people, that the most important person in the whole entire world is always yourself. I know that sounds selfish. I know that, as a mom, I hate to say that because I think about my kids. I put my kids ahead of myself. But the reality is that you are the most important person to yourself. So if you keep that in mind when you go into any situation where you're sort of opposite someone, that person doesn't really care about you. They only care about themselves. So as long as you can make them feel like you're there to help them, and you understand what their goals are, and you can try to meet them as much as you can, you're much more likely to be able to be successful at that negotiation than otherwise.
Obviously, you've spoken to leaders from several major corporations around the world. What are some of the things that you picked up from them that they say is most difficult about being a CEO?
I think the most difficult part about being a CEO is literally, there's only one chair in that whole organization that is like yours. There's no other chair like that. So, one CEO had said to me, when I sit there in that chair, I turn around, there's nobody else behind me. So that's it. The buck stops with you. So I think the fact that you are the decision maker and that everything rises up to that top, I think can be very scary for some of them. I mean, they're all fully equipped to do it, but it is absolutely the last chair in the company. So that's one. And then the second thing that I thought was interesting about CEOs is also just how sort of lonely that job can be. You are the sole decision maker, but you're also the guiding light in the company. And so it's very hard for you to really be totally open to your, to your colleagues, to your team, because if you're worried about something or if you're fearful of something, it's so important how that affects everybody else around you. If the CEO thinks the ship is going down, everyone's ready to leave, everyone's going to start fleeing. So, it's a very lonely spot. And so there's a reason why CEOs get together and they mentor each other, because they have very little of that ability to do that within their own company. So that was another interesting observation about them.
What would you say are some of the most common personality traits you see in some of the most successful CEOs that you've interviewed?
They're all obviously, the most successful of the successful. You don't get to be a CEO of a company without having gone through so many trials and tribulations to fight your way to the top. So they're all very tenacious people, very creative, all doers, execution. But they have different personalities. Some are funnier than others, or some are more extroverted than others. But they're all, you can't be a great CEO. You can't be a CEO, period, if you don't know how to execute. So I think execution is very, very key. Plus having, of course, that big, strategic mind, but really being able to put that strategy and put it into action, I think is a hallmark of a great CEO.
So what do CEOs look for when they hire?
It depends. I think hiring is such a personal thing for people. There are some CEOs like Ken Himmel at Related Urban who, said to me that he likes to hire people who are well-traveled, who have traveled to other countries, have gone somewhere other than the United States. And the reason why is that you're exposed to so much when you're, in another culture, and your mind is so opened up, and your creative juices start flowing. That's the kind of person he wants, is someone who has that desire for those kinds of experiences. Because he's, even though he's in real estate, he's actually in a very creative world, because he's building a massive, amazing properties that nobody's ever seen, and he's being very creative about it. Others like Martin Sorrell at WPP, he said to me that he looks for people who have MBAs, and who come from really good schools, come from Ivy League schools. And that might be a little controversial these days, but his reasoning is that schools have a very great way of filtering, who are the cream of the crop. And in his mind, why wouldn't I want to take people who have already been vetted by the most storied institutions in the world and hire those people? So that's his hiring process. There's others, of course, who, like Steve Ross, who, wants to hire PhDs, he calls them, poor, hungry, and driven. So these are, in his mind, he wants people who are, haven't grown up with silver spoons in their mouths, but are extremely smart, savvy, and driven, because they are nowhere near the level that they want to be. So it's very different. They all have their requirements, but and that's what's very interesting about talent and about the whole dynamic of hiring and retaining the right people around you.
So tell us more about Radiate. It's a media technology platform. Tell us about it, why you started it.
Well, it's related to the book, actually, because when I put the book out, and people were coming to me saying that they had all these questions as well, they wanted more content that was going to help them improve their careers. It made me think that there's some demand out here, and perhaps pretty big demand out here, for this kind of content. So that gave me the idea that there's a platform that we could create that would house a lot of these questions that could be answered by CEOs. Questions from where do you get your best ideas to, how do you give critical feedback? How do you fire someone? All those kind of tough questions. We could then put those answers from these CEOs, put them on this platform that people could access on a daily basis and get sort of their daily dose of actionable inspiration. So that's really what we're building at Radiate.
That's great. What is your goal?
So the goal is to, our mission really, if I were to put it like in one sentence, is we want to transform today's managers into tomorrow's leaders. So we want to provide people, the most actionable kind of information that they can get from the smartest, brains in the world, and give them that information on a daily basis. So our goal is that we will have this platform, very likely subscription-based, that will become a daily habit for people. And they can go there every morning, and it's likely going to be morning, because that's usually when people, they have their goals for the day, and they're like, okay, I'm sorting things out for today. They'll go there every morning, and they'll say, I'm about to give an annual performance. How do I do that? And they type that into the Radiate site. Or they, I need to raise money. What's the big mistake that people make when they raise money? What do these CEOs say? And they can type that in, and a string of videos that will give them that answer pop up. So my goal really is to make Radiate a part of people's daily lives. People who want to improve their careers, build companies, essentially the same people who are reading Work Smart.
Sure. What other types of topics could people search up on the site?
I don't want to say niche, because niche sounds really small, but we're very focused on one vertical, which is just management and leadership. Kind of sounds like a little bit like two, but it's actually very similar. So we're just focused on essentially first-time managers, who many of them are entrepreneurs, by the way, because they all started companies, they're starting to lead teams for the first time. So for us, it's all about management content. So anything related to how do we help you become a better leader and a better manager? So any questions related to that, that's what we want people to see. So you're not going to see people come to our site because they want to find out where to put their money. What asset do they buy to get a return? There's no personal finance questions. You're not going there to learn about what's happening with Apple stock. It's none of that stuff. It's all about just management and leadership.
Okay, Betty, well, this was great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we'll see you next time on SarderTV.